Before playing Vecna, Jamie Campbell Bower spiraled into heroin addiction and said he was 1 week away from dying. He's talked about waking up in places he didn't remember, overdosing, and losing control of his life. He eventually entered rehab, got sober, and described the experience as surviving the darkest years of his life. Before Stranger Things made him famous, Joe Keery survived a serious car accident that easily could have killed him. The car flipped and was completely wrecked, and he later said he only walked away because the airbags deployed at the exact right moment. The crash left him shaken for years, realizing how close he'd come to death before anyone knew his name. Gaten Matarazzo was born with cleidocranial dysplasia, a condition so rare it affects less than 1 in a million people. It left him without collarbones, caused severe skull and dental abnormalities, and forced him into repeated surgeries to expose impacted teeth and install prosthetics. The condition itself can cause brittle bones, dangerous airway problems, and lifelong complications. Before Stranger Things, he was rejected from audition after audition for his appearance, but the show ultimately wrote his real disorder into Dustin's character, and Gaten now uses his platform to raise awareness for those living with CCD. 2018, Richard Bebo Russell, a 28-year-old Horizon Air ground agent, stunned the aviation world when he quietly climbed into a Bombardier Q400 at Seattle-Tacoma Airport, started the engines from knowledge he'd picked up from YouTube and flight simulators, and took off without a license or clearance. For nearly an hour, he flew over Puget Sound chatting calmly with air traffic control, admitting he was a broken guy while performing a full barrel roll in a 76-seat passenger plane. F-15 fighter jets scrambled to intercept him, but he refused to land, steering the aircraft away from cities before deliberately crashing it into the woods of Ketron Island. The explosion killed only him, scorched acres of forest, and exposed a massive security gap at the airport. In 2014, 43-year-old Chad Olson was reportedly texting his babysitter during movie previews when the man behind him, 71-year-old retired police captain Curtis Reeves, told him to put the phone away. The argument escalated. Olson tossed a handful of popcorn in frustration, and Reeves instantly responded by pulling a handgun and shooting him in the chest. Olson died later that day, while his wife was also injured while trying to block the shot with her hand. Despite witnesses saying Olson never got physical beyond the popcorn, a jury ultimately acquitted Reeves in 2022, accepting his claim that he fired in self-defense under Florida's Stand Your Ground law. Misty Lohman's viral mugshots came in the midst of years of personal and medical collapse. Before these images were taken, she had endured the losses of 3 infants in a short span, 1 miscarriage, 1 stillborn, and 1 that died shortly after birth, and she soon turned to drugs to cope with the unimaginable grief. At the same time, her health was unraveling from lupus, bone cancer, and scleroderma, a disease that thins and tightens the skin and can drastically change a person's appearance. As her condition worsened, she was arrested repeatedly for low-level drug charges, including possession, paraphernalia, and failure to appear in court, producing the series of shocking mugshots that later spread online without context. In the years since, Misty has entered long-term treatment, has been sober for 5 years, and now speaks openly about her medical conditions and the losses that shaped her life, pushing back against the misinformation and cruel insults that followed those photos. In November of 2023, 56-year-old Bart Ryder went in for a routine cataract surgery in Colorado and died because no one realized he stopped breathing. A lawsuit later revealed that the surgeon and anesthesiologist were playing a music bingo game during the procedure, and although Ryder was hooked up to monitors, the audible alarms weren't turned on. He soon turned blue under the sheet while staff focused on the playlist instead of his vitals. By the time they realized his oxygen had crashed about 11 minutes in, he'd already suffered fatal cardiac arrest. Both doctors admitted under oath that they were playing the game, and the case was settled outside of court. This photo was taken at 10:28 a.m. on 9/11 by photographer Bill Bigart, just seconds before the North Tower collapsed and killed him. Bigart had rushed toward the burning towers while most people were running away, documenting the chaos from the streets below. When crews later found his body in the rubble, they also recovered his cameras and memory cards, which held the final 150 photos of his life, including this one, time-stamped less than 10 seconds before the collapse buried him where he stood. Before fame, Charlie Heaton lived in a dangerous squat in London while touring with a noise punk band. He's talked about waking up to overdoses in the building, sleeping on floors, surviving on almost no money, and performing in violent clubs where fights routinely broke out. In 2017, he was detained at LAX for cocaine traces in his luggage and temporarily barred from entering the US. Cara Buono's childhood was marked by a near-fatal accident that almost killed her decades before she ever appeared on Stranger Things. At 11 years old, she was struck by a speeding car while walking home in New York, suffering severe injuries and head trauma that required long-term recovery and left her with memory gaps from that entire year of her life. Finn Wolfhard has dealt with disturbing stalking-level behavior since he was barely a teenager. At 14, he said grown adults were waiting outside of his hotel rooms, following him to filming locations, and even tracking down where his family lived, forcing security to intervene more than once. In one of the creepier incidents he's discussed publicly, a group of adult fans learned his exact shooting schedule and routinely appeared wherever he was working, standing silently across the street, something he said made him feel hunted. During World War II, Nazi SS units carried out one of the regime's most disturbing programs, the mass kidnapping of up to 200,000 Polish children for forced Germanization. After being taken from their families, the children were sent to SS-run children's education camps, where they were subjected to horrific racial selection exams. SS doctors measured their skulls, noses, eye colors, and body proportions, trying to determine whether each child looked Aryan enough to be turned into a German. If a child passed the test, they were renamed, stripped of their identity, and adopted into German families as if they'd never been Polish at all. But if they failed, their fate was much darker. Many were transported to concentration camps, where countless children died from starvation, disease, abuse, or execution. Only an estimated 10 to 15% of the kidnapped children were ever found and returned to Poland after the war. At the Nuremberg trials, the Allies confirmed the program a form of genocide, the deliberate attempt to erase an entire population by stealing and remaking their children. Susan King spent 6.5 years in prison for a murder she couldn't possibly have committed. She had one leg, weighed under 100 pounds, and didn't even own a car. Yet police claimed she beat, shot, and dragged a man before tossing his body off a bridge 40 miles away. The lead detective built the entire case on lies, fake ballistics, drag marks that were actually water damage, and blood evidence that never matched the victim. And investigators later admitted they had doubts about her guilt before it even went to trial. But terrified of facing life in prison or the death penalty, Susan took a plea deal and went to prison for murdering a man she never even laid her hands on. Years later, a different man confessed in detail to the murder, even describing facts never released to the public, and even claimed the same detective threatened him to stay quiet. Only then was Susan exonerated, and the state eventually paid her $750,000. The detective who framed her never faced charges. He simply retired while under investigation for unrelated sexual misconduct. This was the moment when a DoorDash delivery driver was caught on camera spraying something into a family's Arby's order, seconds after dropping it off and taking a picture before casually walking away. Indiana man Mark Carden said when his wife began eating, she immediately started choking, gasping, and vomiting, and her husband noticed a strange residue coating the inside of the bag. After reviewing the footage, he realized the driver had allegedly pepper sprayed the food on purpose for reasons no one can explain. The sheriff's office is now investigating, and the case could lead to a felony consumer product tampering charge, the kind filed when a regular delivery turns into a potentially life-threatening attack. A 10-pound mini dachshund named Valerie vanished during a camping trip on Kangaroo Island, then somehow survived 529 days alone in the Australian bush. Rescuers spent months trying to trap her, stunned that such a tiny house dog had endured snakes, heat, and feral predators long enough to actually gain weight. Some think she lived off roadkill, while others believe someone was feeding her, since no one can explain how she lasted nearly a year and a half in one of the harshest landscapes in the world. When she was finally caught using a trap baited with her favorite toys and her owner's clothes, vets found her fit and well, closing one of the most improbable pet survival stories ever documented. This is real footage of the most dangerous object humans have ever created, the elephant's foot inside the ruins of Chernobyl. It looks like a lump of rock, but it's actually corium, a molten mixture of uranium fuel, concrete, steel, and reactor parts that fused together when Reactor 4 tore itself apart in 1986. When this mass formed, it was so radioactive that standing near it for a mere few seconds delivered a fatal dose. In those first few hours, the elephant's foot wasn't just deadly to anyone who approached, it was still hot enough chemically and thermally that if it had burned through the foundation and hit the water reservoirs beneath the plant, it could have triggered a massive steam explosion. Soviet scientists warned that the blast would have torn open the remaining reactors and sent an uncontrollable cloud of nuclear fallout across most of Europe, rendering entire countries uninhabitable. The only reason that didn't happen is because liquidators, many of whom died horribly later on, managed to drain the water and seal the lower levels in time. Early attempts to photograph the elephant's foot were catastrophic. The radiation shredded camera film and interfered with electronics, leaving warped, blistered images where the object barely looked real. Simply entering the corridor meant almost certain death for the human body. The footage shown comes from 1996, 10 years after the accident, where the radiation had dropped just enough for a brief, tightly controlled visit. But it was still extremely dangerous. By then, the mass was emitting mostly alpha radiation, particles that can't penetrate skin yet become lethal if even a single speck is inhaled. The team used ventilation, masks, and moved quickly, knowing the room was still one of the most radioactive places on the planet. Nearly 4 decades later, the elephant's foot remains where it formed. It's much cooler now, but still too radioactive to touch, too heavy to move, and too toxic to ever be safely dismantled. It stands as a permanent monument to a disaster that nearly poisoned half a continent. Russian fitness influencer Dmitry Nuyanzin has died after collapsing during a workout, and investigators say his body had been pushed to the absolute breaking point. The 32-year-old had recently been filming a 10,000-calorie bulking challenge while still cutting water for photo shoots and reportedly cycling stimulants and anabolic agents. Friends said he'd been complaining of dizziness and chest pain but kept training to keep up the content. When he collapsed at the gym, doctors couldn't revive him, and the autopsy showed his heart was severely enlarged and overloaded, more like that of a much older man. Experts concluded he suffered sudden cardiac failure triggered by a perfect storm of extreme overeating, chemical strain, dehydration, and relentless overtraining. Nicholas Kunzelman and Stephanie Hart Grizel survived the Columbine shooting in 1999, only to be mysteriously murdered less than a year later. On February 13, 2000, Stephanie went to visit Nicholas while he was closing the Subway restaurant just a mile from their high school. Hours later, an off-duty employee noticed the lights still on, walked in, and saw an unknown young man leaving. Inside, he found both Columbine teens shot to death behind the counter. Nothing was stolen, so it wasn't a robbery, and the witness gave a detailed description of the suspect, but he was never found. Investigators later uncovered a drug ring operation out of that Subway, but there was no link to the teens. To this day, the killer has never been identified. On May 2, 2001, John Battaglia lured his 2 daughters, 9-year-old Faith and 6-year-old Liberty, to his Dallas apartment for what was supposed to be a routine visitation, even though he was already wanted for violating probation after threatening their mother, Mary Jean Pearl. Furious that she had reported him, he called her on speaker and forced the girls to the phone so that she could hear everything. As Mary Jean begged them to run away, Faith's last words were, "No, Daddy, please don't do it," followed by the sound of multiple gunshots. Battaglia shot both girls with a .45 caliber revolver, then calmly left the apartment, went to a tattoo shop, and had 2 roses inked on his arm to honor them. When police arrived, the girls were found posed and surrounded by their toys. Battaglia showed no remorse at trial, smirked at the prosecutors, and even blew kisses at spectators in the courtroom. He was sentenced to death and eventually executed in 2018, calling himself the happiest man alive moments before the injection. This was the moment when officers found Marvin Morales lying unresponsive on the floor of a station bathroom. A California sheriff's deputy who just overdosed on cocaine he'd stolen from people he arrested, which later tested positive for fentanyl. Deputies had to rush in and administer Narcan to revive him, and he was fired soon afterward. But on December 2, 2025, Morales resurfaced in the most horrific way imaginable. That morning, he stabbed his 11-year-old son multiple times inside their own home, while the boy's 6-year-old sister hid nearby, too terrified to move. Deputies who arrived described blood pooled near the entryway, and signs the boy had tried to crawl toward the front door. Morales fled before anyone could reach him, leading to a pursuit down Interstate 5 that ended when spike strips shredded his tires. As the car crashed to a stop, he reportedly drew a weapon, forcing officers who had worked with him in the past to shoot him. Morales died hours later at the hospital, while the sheriff called the crime one of the most devastating his department had ever encountered. During British rule in India, one of the most horrific execution methods was blowing from a gun, tying a prisoner directly to the muzzle of a cannon and firing it straight into their body. Contemporary accounts from the 1800s describe bodies being torn apart instantly, with the head launched dozens of feet into the air and limbs flung in different directions. The technique was used most famously after the 1857 rebellion, and some museums in Pakistan and India still display wax reenactments of the horrific practice. It remains one of the most brutal documented execution methods in colonial history. After investigators tied multiple typhoid fever outbreaks to American cook Mary Mallon in 1907, doctors told her she was an asymptomatic carrier and banned her from cooking. But she refused to believe it, kept taking kitchen jobs under the same name, and new clusters of the disease kept appearing. When officials caught her doing it again in 1915, they sent her to North Brother Island, where she was detained for the rest of her life. Mary spent her final 23 years quarantined there, ultimately linked to more than 50 confirmed infections, earning her the nickname Typhoid Mary. In 2017, 22-year-old YouTuber Pedro Ruiz III tried to film a stunt where a hardcover encyclopedia would stop a .50 caliber round from a Desert Eagle. He had already tested the trick once before with a smaller gun, giving him the confidence to try it again, this time asking his pregnant girlfriend Mona Lisa Perez to fire from just a foot away. But the .50 cal round tore straight through the encyclopedia and into his chest, killing him instantly as two cameras recorded the stunt and their 3-year-old daughter stood nearby. Family members later said they'd warned him these viral stunts would get him killed. Perez pleaded guilty to manslaughter and was sentenced to 180 days in jail, and their unborn son was later named after Pedro. In Tampa, Florida, a long-lost cemetery quietly vanished from records for nearly a century, until a local newspaper traced old land deeds and realized a public housing complex had been built directly on top of it. When archaeologists scanned the ground with radar, they found over 100 graves still buried under the apartment complex in perfectly neat rows. The housing authority later confirmed they wouldn't disturb the bodies. Instead, they began relocating residents and announced plans to turn the land into a memorial park for the forgotten dead. This woman convinced herself she needed human blood to survive the way other people need food. Starting in 1989, Brisbane's Tracy Wigington started killing animals, storing their bodies, and drinking their blood in private feedings before deciding she needed a living human victim. With 3 friends, she lured 47-year-old Edward Baldock into her car and drove him to a riverbank. The moment he stepped out, Wigington ambushed him with a hunting knife so violently that investigators said the wounds were frenzied and his throat was sliced so deep his head was nearly severed. She crouched over him as he died and drank from the blood pouring from the gash in his neck. Detectives later said the scene was so saturated with blood it looked ritualistic, and photos recovered from Wigington showed she'd been staging mock sacrifices with her friends in the months leading up to the murder. When police searched her belongings, they also found jars of preserved animal remains and notebooks describing her goal of becoming a fully transformed vampire. She pleaded guilty and received life in prison, yet still walked free in 2012, leaving one of Australia's most senseless and sadistic murders behind her. An elementary school outing in British Columbia turned into absolute chaos on November 20th, 2025, when a grizzly bear suddenly charged a group of 4th and 5th graders from a wall to school as they paused on a riverside trail. 11 people were injured during the attack, including 2 children who were rushed to the hospital in critical condition, while 7 others were treated at the scene. Teachers fought the bear off with bear spray and a bear banger, likely preventing multiple deaths. The bear soon escaped back into the forest and has still not been found, and officials say they don't know what triggered the attack or whether the animal will strike again. What's especially unsettling is that the attack happened to a group large enough that grizzlies normally avoid entirely, suggesting something was deeply wrong with the monstrous animal. And until conservation officers track it down, the entire valley remains on edge, knowing an injured and unpredictable grizzly bear is still lurking somewhere in the shadows. Did we cross a minute yet? We did. We did? Okay. In 2020, Megan Thee Stallion survived an attack that left her bleeding in the street, shot in both of her feet as she tried to walk away from a late-night argument. Bullet fragments tore into the back of her left heel and scattered through the soles of both feet. Injuries so deep that surgeons couldn't remove all the shrapnel, and pieces are still lodged inside her body. The man she identified as the shooter was later convicted and sentenced, but Megan has said the worst part wasn't the pain. It was being viciously mocked online by people who insisted she was lying, exaggerating, or milking the incident while she was recovering from gunshot wounds. In 1910 Los Angeles, a woman named Miss Bell had been searching for her missing Scotch Terrier for weeks when her friend G.E. Seawright stumbled upon the answer by pure nightmare coincidence. The man was having a hot dog for lunch when he suddenly bit down on something hard, a small metal object hidden deep inside his meal. When he fished it out and wiped it clean, he immediately froze. Stamped on the metal was the identification number of Miss Bell's missing dog. Only then did he realize the horrific truth. The dog had somehow been cooked into the meat of a local hot dog stand. On July 5th, 2011, 37-year-old Kelly Thomas, a homeless man with schizophrenia, was beaten, pinned down, and repeatedly tased by Fullerton police during a violent violent encounter captured on audio and surveillance footage. Officers had responded to a call about someone allegedly breaking into cars, and when they found Thomas rummaging through trash near a bus depot, they claimed he became uncooperative during questioning, a claim later disputed by witnesses and contradicted by portions of the footage. As officers piled on top of him, Thomas screamed for his father, begged them to stop, and cried out that he was being killed. Prosecutors later noted he said, "Dad, help me," 31 times, "Help me, God," 26 times, and "Okay" or "I'm sorry" over and over as he slipped into unconsciousness. He arrived at the hospital in a coma with severe head trauma, multiple broken bones in his face, irreversible brain swelling, and died 5 days later. 2 officers were charged, including one for second-degree murder, but both of them walked free after the case collapsed in court. In 1957, 2 young sisters in England, Joanna and Jacqueline Pollock, were killed instantly when a speeding car suddenly struck them during their walk to church. Their parents were shattered by the loss, but a year later they had twin daughters, Jillian and Jennifer, who as they grew began showing strange overlaps with the former girls' lives, recognizing toys they'd never seen, describing places they'd never visited, and developing an intense fear of cars. Jennifer was reportedly even born with birthmarks in the same locations as Jacqueline's. The memories eventually faded, but the Pollock twins became one of the most cited cases in discussions of childhood reincarnation, with some people believing it was true reincarnation and others arguing it was grief, suggestion, or outright coincidence. A 6-year-old boy from Missouri was subjected to a staged kidnapping orchestrated by his own family to teach him a lesson about stranger danger. Police say an aunt's coworker lured him into a truck, told him he'd never see his mother again, and threatened to nail him to the wall of a shed. When he started sobbing, the man showed him a handgun and ordered him to stop crying. Investigators say he tied the boy's hands and feet, covered his face, and drove him around for hours while the child begged to go home. Once back at the house, relatives brought him into the basement and kept the act going, lecturing him about strangers while he was still terrified and restrained. Multiple adults were later charged after authorities said the ordeal caused genuine trauma, inflicted by the very people meant to protect him. Here's a photo of what can happen when a hair dye allergy goes catastrophically wrong. This young woman suffered a violent reaction to PPD, a chemical found in most at-home dye kits, and within hours her forehead began swelling so fast it nearly doubled in size. The reaction triggered angioedema, a dangerous buildup of fluid that pooled around her eyes and scalp, warping the shape of her head and leaving one eye almost swollen shut. Doctors warn that reactions like this can escalate to throat swelling and suffocation if left untreated, and that once your body reacts to PPD, even a tiny exposure in the future can set off something even worse. In Hangzhou, China, visitors can find 2 iron statues permanently forced to kneel, Qin Hui and his wife Wang. They were the officials blamed for framing and executing the national hero Yu Fei in 1142. For nearly 900 years, visitors have treated the figures as if they were still alive and deserving punishment, spitting on them and smacking their heads in a ritual of public contempt. The hatred ran so deep that locals had to keep rebuilding the statues multiple times because people kept destroying them, turning these kneeling effigies into one of the longest-running acts of symbolic vengeance in history. Grace Van Dien, aka Chrissy, revealed that she was groomed by a producer while working on another project, an experience she said left her traumatized enough to step away from acting entirely. She described it as one of the darkest times of her life, saying Hollywood had become unsafe for her and that the incident permanently changed how she views the industry. Before Stranger Things, Brett Gelman endured years of darkness, losing his younger brother in a sudden tragedy, spiraling through severe depression, and battling suicidal thoughts while he struggled to afford rent and avoid homelessness. He says he was quietly blacklisted in Hollywood for speaking out against abusive workplaces, leaving him convinced his career would be over before it ever started. Mark Steger, the performer inside the Demogorgon suit, has said the role was one of the most physically dangerous of his career. The practical suit trapped extreme heat, restricted movement, and weighed so much that he repeatedly suffered heat exhaustion, ligament strain, and even collapsed during takes. At one point, he collapsed so fast the crew thought he'd gone into cardiac arrest. Steger said the Demogorgon required total body endurance just to survive filming days. Steve Buscemi was nearly killed in 2001 when he stepped in to break up a bar fight in North Carolina and was suddenly ambushed by a knife-wielding attacker. He was stabbed multiple times in the face, throat, and arm, suffering deep wounds from a completely unprovoked assault. Vince Vaughn also got involved in the fight and was arrested during the chaos but wasn't charged. The man who stabbed Buscemi was later charged with assault and intent to kill. Just a few months later, when the 9/11 attacks hit his home city, Buscemi quietly returned to the FDNY firehouse where he once served as a firefighter in the 1980s. He worked 12-hour shifts digging through rubble alongside first responders, refusing interviews, taking no photos, and asking not to be recognized. In 2018, 16-year-old Carly Goose came home terrified after what her family described as a bad reaction to smoking weed at a party. She spent the night completely panicked, paranoid, and unable to sleep. Then sometime before sunrise, she quietly slipped out of her house without her phone, shoes, or glasses. Neighbors reported seeing her alongside a highway at dawn, disoriented and staring straight ahead. But by the time deputies searched